Welcome. Today we're going to explore the two branches of the United States government that create and interpret our nation's laws, Congress and the judiciary. Now, on the surface, their roles seem distinct. One makes laws, the other interprets it. But the reality is a dynamic, sometimes contentious relationship that defines the limits of our American government and the balance of power. Now, this lecture will examine each branch individually, from their constitutional origins to their modern functions. We'll look at how Congress is structured and how a bill becomes a law. Then we'll look at the courts, exploring the power of judicial review and the path a case takes to the Supreme Court. Finally, and the most important, we'll analyze how these two powerful institutions, these two chambers, they establish checks and balances towards each other in an ongoing constitutional framework. Now let's begin with the branch of government that the founders considered the first branch of government, Congress. Now, the foundation of the legislative branch is laid out in Article 1 of the Constitution. The founders envisioned Congress as the most powerful branch, as the direct voice of the people. But they were also wary of its unchecked power, so their solution was to create bicameralism, which is a legislature split into two houses, one based on population, the other based on equal representation. And this came from the Great Compromise of 1787. And it was also known as the Connecticut Compromise. And it was a really important agreement reached during the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And what it did was resolve a fundamental dispute between the large states and the small states. Now, the large states, they favored what was called the Virginia Plan, which was representation in Congress based on population, and you can imagine that larger states would want that. But the smaller states, they supported what was called the New Jersey Plan, which was equal representation for each of the states regardless of its population. And of course, a small state would support something like that would favor them. So the compromise was an establishment of a bicameral or two-chamber legislature. One was the House of Representatives, and that was the representation that was based on the state's population, and that satisfied the large states. The other was the Senate, and where each state was equally represented with two senators regardless of its population, and this satisfied the small states. Now, the system of representation, it was balanced, created a balance of power between the states of the different sizes, and it was a really important compromise to ratify the U.S. Constitution. It became one of the things that was a kind of a sticking point that stalled the ratification of the Constitution. So we'll talk about the two chambers. Now, with both parts of Congress, the House and the Senate, they have distinct personalities and roles. Now, the House, it has 435 members currently, and they all serve 2-year terms, and is designated to a more responsive and what they consider a volatile chamber. It's where all the passions of the moment and the most keenly felt current events are felt. Now, its proceedings, they're very highly structured and they have very strict rules on debate time because there are so many members. 435 members, you have to have strict rules on debate time or you'll never get anything done. Now, in the Senate, in contrast, is a more, they consider, deliberate body. It only has 100 members, with two for each state. But each of these senators, they serve a 6-year term. Now, it was intended to be more of a stabilizing force than the House of Representatives. Remember, they're only serving 2-year terms. So there's more stability with the Senate, and it's insulated from a lot of the current events, what they call the fleeting whims of public opinion. And the rules kind of reflect this, which it allows for extended debate. And there's this practice called the filibuster, which gives it unlimited time in order to debate. And this is a procedural tactic, and it's very unique to the Senate. And what it does is it allows a senator or a group of senators to delay or block a vote on a bill by extending debate indefinitely. And it's happened on numerous occasions. And since Senate has a tradition of unlimited debate, a senator can hold the floor and speak for as long as they're able to, and this prevents the Senate from conducting any other business or voting on that measure that's up for debate. Now, in order to end this filibuster, the Senate must invoke what's called cloture, and then a separate procedure needs to take place, and that requires a supermajority of 60 votes. And that's really hard to achieve, and because it's very rare for one party to hold 60 out of the 100 seats. So in turn, this gives the filibuster gives the minority party a significant amount of power in Senate, and a significant amount of leverage to block the majority's agenda. The majority, even if you have a majority of, let's say, 55, 58, the minority still can block it with the filibuster. It's very rare that you get over 60% of the Senate. Now, the path that a bill takes to become a law is often called a legislative obstacle course, and it is for good reason. Most bills fail. Now, most bills begin with an idea, which is then often drafted into a bill, and that bill is introduced to either the House or the Senate. A bill can start from either chamber. From there, it's sent to a specialized committee, and this is where all the debate and all the real work begins. These bills are studied, they're debated, but this is often where the bills die. However, if a bill does survive the committee process, it goes to the full floor for a vote. If it passes one of the chambers, either the House or the Senate, it must then go through the entire process again in the other chamber. Now, many times, the House and the Senate pass different versions of the same bill, which must then be reconciled in a conference committee before it gets sent to the president's desk. Now, only after a single identical bill has been approved by both chambers, then that can be sent to the president. And the president either signs it into law or the president vetoes it. Now, this process, it seems like a very complex process, but it was very intentional. It was designed to be this way, and it ensured that only laws with very broad support could be enacted. And some people complain about that. This is, well, Congress can never get anything done. Grant, this is very intentional. Now let's talk about the congressional powers. Now, beyond lawmaking, Congress also holds several other critical powers, and the most significant is the power of the purse, power to control money and funds. The exclusive authority, actually, to raise and spend national funds lies with Congress. Now, this is actually the ultimate checks on all the other branches. Congress has the power to declare war, It has the power to conduct oversight of the executive branch through hearings, investigations, and the Senate also has the power to confirm presidential appointees or declare that they, or unconfirm them if they, through the process of hearings and investigations, decide that the presidential appointee is unfit for the office that they're chosen for. Now, representation is another key function. Members of Congress act as delegates, trustees, or politicos, as they call them. And what they have to do is balance the needs of their constituents who voted for them with the national interest, maintaining that everything abides by the Constitution no matter what their constituents want. If their constituents want something that's unconstitutional, they have to act ethically in the national interest and make decisions based on that, sometimes balancing that where you go against the constituents. But you're not really, as a statesperson, no, you should not be in a position to do something that's unconstitutional. Now, these implied powers, they pretty much make Congress a very powerful institution and very central to our function of government. Now, as far as representation, there's two different models that is enacted with members of Congress. It's the delegate model, which is voting exactly how your constituents wish, or the trustee model, which is using the best judgment to vote in the national interest. Now we're going to talk about the courts, and we'll shift our focus on the judicial branch. Now, again, it's a branch that's established by the Constitution, in this case, Article 3 of the Constitution. And the article is surprisingly, it's pretty brief, creating the Supreme Court and giving Congress the power to create lower federal courts. But the true power of the judiciary was not explicitly written in the Constitution, actually. It was established with the 1803 case of Marbury versus Madison. And it gave the power of the courts to declare laws or executive actions unconstitutional. Now, this is a power that's not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, but it was created with the 1803 court case of Marbury versus Madison. And this is arguably the most important case in Supreme Court history. And what happened is, in the final days of John Adams' presidency, he appointed several judges, but his Secretary of State failed to actually physically deliver all of the commissions, and these were written documents, state documents that were supposed to be hand-delivered, notarized and hand-delivered. But the Secretary of State failed to do so. So then when the new president, Thomas Jefferson, came in and took office, his Secretary of State, James Madison, refused to deliver those commissions, mainly for political reasons, because those judges did not share the same political philosophy of both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. So James Madison refused to deliver them. One of those who were expecting the commission was William Marbury, who was one of the appointees. So he ended up suing James Madison, the new Secretary of State, and asked the Supreme Court to issue a writ of forcing the delivery. Now, Justice John Marshall, Chief Justice John Marshall, ruled that while Marbury was entitled to his commission, the Supreme Court did not have the constitutional authority to force the executive branch to deliver that commission. And he declared that the law giving the court that power was unconstitutional. And what was the law giving that court that power? Well, that was the Judiciary Act of 1789. And that was an act of Congress. Now, an act of Congress gave another branch a power to do something very specific, which was force a statesperson to do something. And it's interesting because the decision of Justice John Marshall saying, well, we don't have the power to enforce this, took away that power to do that very specific thing, according to the Judiciary Act of 1789. However, in doing so, it gave the Supreme Court an even more important power. It established the principle of judicial review, and that's the power of the Supreme Court to declare laws and executive actions unconstitutional. And that's very important, and that's way more powerful than just forcing a statesperson to carry out a certain act. And it's probably the most powerful check on the other two branches of government. Now, the federal judiciary operates as a three-tiered pyramid. Take a look at the bottom. At the bottom, you see there are 94 district courts. And these trial courts of the federal system, this is where cases are heard for the first time, evidence is presented, trial is held, and decisions are made. Every state has at least one district court. And the larger states have, such as Texas and California, has more than one district court. Now, if one of the parties of the court proceedings is not happy with the district court's decision, they can appeal to the next level, and that's one of the 13 circuit courts of appeals. Now, these courts, they don't retry the case again. They have what is called appellate jurisdiction, which is the ability to, the power to review and potentially overturn the decision of a lower court. And unlike original jurisdiction, where a court hears a case for the first time, any court with appellate jurisdiction does not hold trials. Instead, like I said, they review the record of the lower court to determine if a legal or procedural error was made that affected the outcome of the case. Now, the U.S. Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court, those are the two levels that have, like I said, appellate jurisdiction. Now, the courts, like I said, they don't retry the cases. Instead, a panel of 3 judges review the trial record from the district court to determine, like I said, if any legal errors were made. And the U.S. is divided into 12 regional circuits, with the 13th federal circuit that has a nationwide jurisdiction over specific types of cases. Now you see at the very top of the pyramid sits the final court of appeal, which is the Supreme Court. Now we'll talk about how a case reaches the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court has almost complete control over its own docket. Of the thousands of cases appealed to it each year, about 7,000 plus, the court only hears about 70 or 80. Now, for a court case to be heard, a party must file what is called a writ of certiorari, and that is an order from the Supreme Court to a lower court to send up the records of a case for review. And this is how most cases arrive to the Supreme Court. What happens is the justices then meet in private conference to vote on which of these cases to accept after they receive the information. And this is governed by what they call the informal rule of four. And it's if at least 4 of the 9 justices agree to hear a case, certiorari is granted and the case is placed on the docket. The court typically chooses cases that involve significant constitutional questions or resolve a split in legal interpretation among the lower circuit courts. Now, the Solicitor General, just to let you know what that is, um, the current Solicitor General is D. John Sawyer, who has served since 2025. And what a Solicitor General is, the fourth ranking official in the Department of Justice, and is the lawyer who represents the federal government before the Supreme Court. They're appointed by the president, and they must be confirmed by the Senate. So there's another checks and balances. The Solicitor General's office decides which case the government should ask the Supreme Court to review and what the government's position will be in those cases. Interesting. So a Solicitor General has a very powerful position. And I must say, most people don't know that there is actually a position called the Solicitor General. Now, how do justices decide cases? They are guided by judicial philosophy. Now, the central debate is the difference between judicial activism and judicial restraint. Now, activist judges, they're more willing to strike down laws and interpret the Constitution in a more modern context. Judges who practice judicial restraint are more likely to defer to the elected branches, the decisions of Congress, and adhere to precedent. And this leads to a principle of stare decisis, or let the decision stand. And this encourages judges to follow precedent established in previous cases. Now, after a case is decided, the court issues a ruling through its written opinions. And the majority opinion explains the legal reasoning why it came to that decision. And the justices who agree with the outcome, if they agree with the outcome but for different reasons, they may write a concurring opinion that is attached to the majority opinion. However, those in the minority opinion, those who voted against the outcome, they can write a dissenting opinion. Now, this can influence future legal arguments, and in some cases eventually become the basis for overturning a precedent. And this is something that we're going to examine in the future when we take a look at Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus Board of Education, because essentially that is what happened. Is the dissenting opinion in Plessy versus Ferguson was actually used to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson later during Brown versus Board of Education. And if we take a look at the history of the court, there's 3 eras that we can look at. And they're broadly divided into 3 different time periods. And there's a central question that each of these eras faced. It's reflective of what was going on and how our country was forming. The first era was of nation building, and it was a question of federalism. And it was concerned with defining the balance of power between the federal government and the states. Now, from the late 19th century through this New Deal, it focused on economic regulation. And the court was wrestling with government's power to regulate business, labor, and the industrial complex that was increasingly growing and becoming the biggest part of our country's economy. Then, from the mid 20th century, the court has been dominated by the question of civil liberties and civil rights, addressing issues of free speech, privacy, and equality under the law. In these eras, they show how the court adapts and to the changing needs, the changing conflicts of our nation. Now, this brings to pretty much the heart of the discussion, and that's the institutional tug of war between Congress and the courts. Now, neither branch has absolute power. Now, Congress's primary check on the judiciary is its power over the appointments and the structure. Now, the Senate must confirm all federal judges, and it's a very highly political process, and sometimes it's very front and center on national TV, especially the last few appointees of the Supreme Court. They're very highly charged, highly politicized, highly covered by all of the media. Now, Congress can also determine the number of justices on the Supreme Court, and that's been debated lately also to increase the number of Supreme Court justices. It has the power to create lower federal courts, and it has the power to even strip the courts of its jurisdiction over certain types of cases. And sometimes, in the most extreme cases, Congress can impeach and remove federal judges. Now, on the other hand, the judiciary's ultimate check on Congress is its judicial review, which we talked about earlier. In the Supreme Court, it can strike down any law that Congress passed that it deems to be unconstitutional. And it's done this throughout history on issues from economic regulations to civil rights. And this push and pull between the two branches of Congress and the judiciary, it pretty much ensures that there will be a balance, and both of them have to remain within their constitutional boundaries. Now, in conclusion, Congress and the judiciary are locked in a relationship of both conflict, but they also have to have a level of cooperation. Now, the Congress, they write the laws, but the court says what those laws mean. The court interprets the Constitution, but Congress has the power to shape the courts themselves. This system, it's not designed for efficiency. It's designed to be slow. But it was designed that way to protect liberty by forcing a compromise, preventing any one branch from becoming too powerful. And us as citizens, as voters, we need to understand this process. And in understanding this dynamic, it's essential to understanding the American government in general. It's understanding our system, where the legislative, the judicial branches, they're constantly in conflict, negotiating, pushing the boundaries of power. It's a process that's continuing. It's even to this day, every day, there's still a battle between the three branches of government. And it's a process that's going to continue through our lifetime and beyond.